Hi, this is Carson with Troy, and I have with me Rocco Levitas. Rocco is an epic fantasy author. His first book came out in October, correct?
Yes, October 17th.
Okay, and the name of that book is The Seam of Eternity, and it is the first book of the series The Veins of Eternity. Is that correct?
Yes, you have it right. I have my little book baby right here.
That's
So it's a lot
fantastic.
of fun to put together.
So, Rocco, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about your book.
I've always read epic fantasy growing up. I think I even used to go camping with my family, and I didn't always fit in with my family. I was a closeted gay boy, trying to fit in with a straight religious family. And I would find escape in fantasy. So I'd be on family camping trips and I'd be reading Terry Goodkind with his sort of true series. The Hobbit is what really took me away to it all. But I decided, hey, you know what? I found a really good escape in fantasy, and I want to be able to give that to other people. And I will also mention that I'm on very good terms with my family. So it's funny how you blow all these things out of perspective in your mind, and then things work out for the best in the end.
Right. No, it usually does a lot of times. Sometimes it doesn't, but I'm glad that it worked out well for you and your family. That's really
Yes.
good. So, what was the idea that sparked this book?
I think it really does go back um, to, I mean, I don't actually write LGBT fantasy at all. Um, but I had this idea where, I love epic fantasy. I love all the different cultures that you get to explore and wander through it as the author guides you. And I was reading, there were a lot of stories that I was reading. I felt like there was a kind of agenda being pushed, and it didn't quite sit right with me. And I said, you know what? I'm seeing that a lot in my daily life. I see a lot of different perspectives. I mean, if you look at my social media, I've got my very liberal and very conservative sides of the spectrum all in one place. And yet when they all meet each other and they say, "Oh yeah, so and so was great. Oh, I had no idea they had that different belief than me." It's surprising to see how often they really just got along so well together. So I wanted to write an epic fantasy about a world where, all these people have different beliefs and they don't necessarily all get along, even though they all want what they think is best. And in the meantime, you've got an ancient evil stirring in the background that's on the brink of escaping from his eternal prison. And the question is, can the world unite and get over their squabbles in order to fight off this apocalyptic catastrophe?
Awesome. Sounds fantastic. Now, I haven't had a chance to read yet. I have the ebook, but that's soon I will be able to read that. And I'm looking forward to it. It sounds exciting. So, it's a epic fantasy story. So, did you do an outline? Are you a pantser? Like, what's some of your writing habits?
Yeah, so I thought I was a plotter. Turns out I'm really not the best plotter, but I'm somewhere between a plotter and a pantser. I think for me, especially having gone through this once, I only have one book out there, so I'm by no means an ex general framework and saying like, hey, I know I've got my inciting incident, and I know I split into like a five-part of these five milestones. So you have the setup, and then your inciting incident, and then the first kind of bad thing that happens, then your second larger scale bad thing that happens, and then your finale. So as long as I kept myself focused on those distinct points and reminded myself, hey, I've got to have X, Y, and Z happen between these 2 points to get it done.
Awesome. That's more people I talk to, like there's very little people, or there's very few people that actually like outline like specifically chapter by chapter. Lots of times it's like you, where it's just mileposts or goalposts that they try to get. So you're kind of in the majority of that. And like it's funny because
Yeah,
people will say they're a pantser, but do the same thing, and then people will be like, "Oh yeah, I'm a plotter," but do set the goalposts. It's like they're talking about the same thing, but they consider themselves different. It's kind of interesting.
exactly. It's like we have different terminology for the same core concept. for me personally, and I am sure you probably know Brandon Sanderson, and of course he put a series of courses that he put up from BYU on YouTube.
Mhm.
Something that he said that really resonated with me, he was like, look, you've got, I think he even has a blog with an example of this. But at any point, you've got a, a section of your book and you know you want person A to get with person B by the end, and you have a limited space to make that happen. So just pick a scene and choose three things that absolutely must happen by the end of that scene. And I just go in with that big picture view, and often my characters kind of surprise me with how they choose to arrive at their destination, but it, adds a little more fun to the story for me as an author. And then after I finish, I can go back and clean things up and make sure all my payoffs have the proper setups.
Right. Isn't that funny though? Because like you think as an author, or like people on the outside talking to you, you're like, oh, like my main character just did this. I didn't know what was going to happen. And they're like, what do you mean they didn't know it was going to happen? Like you're in control, but you're not. It's amazing.
in my in my book, I have two main characters. There's one, Callan, he's kind of a reluctant hero, and your classic fantasy, kind of rural, grew up in a mountain village type character. And then I also have a character, her name is Fasha, and she is a member of this realm shifting monk order. Um, and honestly, like I've probably gone through three versions of this book. I keep on looking because I have it right next to me. Um, Vasha kind of just popped up one day as I was writing, and I was just like, oh, I think I'm onto something here. I never intended to have her as a character, and now my story would not work without her. And she's quite honestly my favorite character. I can't imagine my story without her, really.
Well, you mentioned the Sword of Truth. I read the Sword of Truth in the early 2000s, and I remember like I was like, I was a big epic fantasy. Like I love Wheel of Time and you know, Tad Williams,
Hmm.
just those books growing up. And when I read, the Sword of Truth, I got on Terry Goodkind's blog and his website, and it kind of was like basic bare bones, but he kind of like mentioned like how he came up with the story, and he said like, is it Kaylin? Is that how you pronounce her name?
I think
Kaylin and
so.
Richard. Kaylin, like she just walked into his mind one day when he was like working on his house or something like that. It was crazy. So like, yeah, that just happens. Like people just show up in your mind, and you're like, oh, I have to. This person is just going to be introduced to the world now. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of the fun of exploring a world that you're making is that you discover things.
Exactly. And you get the same joy as readers will later on. So you get to experience
Hmm.
it too. Although you said this was the third version, or you went through three different versions of this book. Is that correct?
Yes. Oh my
Or
goodness,
maybe more.
my first version, I still have it on my computer, but I don't think it's ever going to see the light of day. That was back in college, and I had just started getting into writing. Um, I remember I had an English teacher who I was so excited. I said, "Hey, Mrs. Hickson, would you mind reading this over a summer?" So I gave her this like 100-page printed manuscript that only was the first leg of my story. I got it. She mailed it back to me in the middle of the summer, and I looked at it. There was one word that she wrote at the end of like this chapter where a character's mother dies, and it's not a scene that even exists in the book, so don't worry, I'm not giving any spoilers. Um, and in big, bold letters, she wrote trite. And I didn't actually realize that what that meant at the time for some reason. So I go bragging to my sister. I'm like, look what Mrs. Hickson wrote. And she's like, that's not a compliment right there. I was like, oh. So I spent a lot of time actually writing short stories at craft, learning how to really work on descriptions and character building. So, a lot of these I just did for fun for friends and family. But I think that's where I really started honing my craft. And eventually, about a year ago, is when I got serious and said, hey, I want to really take my writing to the next level. And I want to get back to that book. So, here it is. And I've
Awesome.
actually got the next two books already have their first drafts.
Oh wow, the next two books have their first drafts. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, one's a prequel novella.
Okay.
So I'm getting that one out the door, and then I'm actually sending it to my editor on Monday next week, for his developmental edits, and then I dig into book two's manuscript, its first draft.
Well, let's talk about this. Being self-published, you're kind of in charge of everything. How did you find your editor?
Yeah, it came through a recommendation. I'm part of an group of other indie authors, and um, one of my friends recommended my editor to me. His name's Zach Ty. I love his work. His website is, oh gosh, it's either copysmiths.org or .com, and it's SMYTHS. But I really love his work. And yeah, the level of plot holes that he caught in my first book is, I was like, oh dang, I really need to address that. But because of it, I think I have.
There's lots of different editors out there. You chose to do a development. Did you do like a line edit or anything like that? Did you hire one or did you just do it
Um,
yourself?
I just did it myself, and I do use some software. I use Pro Writing Aid, and um, I personally really love it. I'm not sure if it's considered controversial as AI, but one of the things that I really like about Pro Writing Aid is it will tell you, you can say, hey, here's my favorite author, Robert Jordan. And it's not that it tells me to write in his style, but rather it'll take a look at works that are similar to that and analyze, hey, there's roughly X percent of sentences that start with a subject and X percent that start with an adverb or a prepositional phrase, etc. And then it says, compared to those published works, here's your breakdown. And suddenly I start seeing, oh my gosh, most works only start with 65% subject first sentences, and I've got 83. Like, how can I change that? And I've looked after making some changes and changing the flow so something starts with the prepositional phrase, it just makes the narrative flow when you're reading out loud. And I started to realize that I was able to do this more on my own too. So each chapter I wrote was getting less and less um, robotic. I'm not sure, really blocky maybe is the best word to use there. So I did that for my line edits. Um, and I think another thing I did for my line edits was more of a research type technique. I would read a chapter or two of Eye of the World, that's one of my favorite books, and Gordon energy and that descriptive mentality, even though I think he gets a little bit too descriptive sometimes. So hopefully I don't go too far in that direction. But I loved seeing the way he would describe people, even if it was just an adjective he would use to describe a person, and see the way that he really made his characters go through a kind of crisis, naive, realizing she can channel, and how she's denying it, and she tries to deny it like 7 times. Try to take that approach with my own writing and say, okay, I've got character A has to do something that he doesn't necessarily want to do. How is he actually going to think through that? And then I think it really helped with my line edits as far as dialogue went too.
Awesome. That's fantastic. That's also great advice and maybe a tip or trick that if somebody wants to use, they can use that software as well. If they want to, and even that exercise of reading other people's works and figuring out like, okay, Brandon Sanderson does this really well, or Robert Jordan did this really well, analyze their work and try to look
Mhm.
into how they can improve themselves. Not really copy, but like this method and be able to adapt it yourself.
Exactly, exactly.
So your book came out, looked fantastic. The cover is amazing. How did you find your cover artist?
I did a lot of research. I was looking at other books doing quite well, and I put a list of, I copied the images, like 20 of the top images that were similar to my style of writing. The person I found, a designer on what I wanted the cover to be, I looked at these kind of prevailing visual tropes, if you will, on the images and said, hey, I've got these elements in my story that would work perfectly here, and I'm really, really pleased with how it turned out.
Awesome. Yeah, it looks fantastic. In fact, Andy Peliquin did a review, and a couple of comments was like, "This cover looks fantastic. Like it just looks amazing. It tells your story,
Yes,
of epic fantasy. Like you can look at it and be like, yep, this is exactly what I'm looking for." So the artist did a fantastic job.
exactly. I highly recommend Jeff Brown Graphics, jeffbrowngraphics.com. You can find him there.
So your book came out in October. Obviously, you want to sell the book. Marketing is one of those things that sometimes people don't think about when they're writing their book. Especially as an indie author, you're in charge of all of that. What have you found that's been successful, and what have been some of your challenges?
Yeah, well, I think some of my challenges is that my biggest challenge is I have no idea what I'm doing. This is my first book, so I'm still kind of like flying by the seat of my pants here. But with that said, so as you know, but for anybody listening right now, Carson and I met at 20 Books in Vegas. Just what was that last
Almost
month? Was that November? Yeah, it's December. That was November. Um, and Brian Cohen had given a talk in marketing. So he said, you're gonna leave here and you're gonna have a ton of awesome, shiny things that are gonna distract you. But at the end of the day, if you really want to keep yourself sane, focus on one writing technique and one marketing technique and really dive hard on those until you feel comfortable and then add another one into your repertoire. So personally, I have decided to take the TikTok and social media approach. Um, I actually, I love data, um, and I love ads and seeing, that there's hard data you can look at, like, hey, the copy on this ad performs. Since I only have one book out, I decided it's probably not the most cost-effective way for me to focus on marketing right now. Um, so I decided to, put my full efforts into TikTok. I'm currently trying to get to 1,000 followers because at that point, good things happen for you. And when you get to 5,000 followers, great things happen for you. It's has to do with being able to add links into your profile or having a TikTok shop.
oh, cool.
So I'm currently I just broke 500 followers earlier today, I think.
Well, congratulations.
So if you're listening, you can follow me at Rocco Levitas author on TikTok. And I have seen, like, I've been posting different, some of it's just media to engage readers, like the question of the day. It's been a lot of fun putting those together and seeing what people come up with as their answers. And then some of them are just kind of silly memes. But at the end of the day, I'm just trying to get my book out there. And I have seen a small uptick in sales, and I'm pretty sure that comes from, kind of regularly putting this content out. And the other thing that I've noticed is my newsletter has grown uh, pretty significantly just based on people, I guess, finding a link to sign up for my newsletter. I mentioned that I like data, so I'm also tracking to see, hey, where are people coming in from? Are they coming in from a newsletter swap with another author, or from the link in the front cover of my book, or from social media? So it's heavily leaning towards social media right now as my greatest source of newsletter subscribers.
Oh wow, that's cool. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, what have you found like is the right amount of consistency? That's like, do you do once a day or like twice a day? Like, how often do you engage on social media?
I try to post 2 to 3 times a day. Um, and I've been seeing a consistent rise in follows and engagement. So that's what I've been told works, and to me, it seems to be working. I've really only been doing a TikTok effort for the last like 3.5 weeks, but in that time, I've gone from 105 followers up to over 500 right now.
Awesome. That's always like what's the magic bullet that can transformed me into TikTok superstar. And so like, and really it comes down to consistency. And I guess, you said 2 to 3 times, and that to me, and when I talk to people, that sounds about right. Like what people have been doing to find growth.
Yes. And when I first started doing TikTok, especially before the 20 Books conference, I was spending maybe 3 to 5 hours putting together a like 30-second clip. And I was like, there's no way I can possibly sustain doing this while also trying to keep writing and just deal with life. I had kind of stopped for a while. After 20 books, I got so many to like use to where you just like literally drop an image in and you can add some funny text and people love it.
Yeah.
I personally love it when I'm scrolling through TikTok and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess other people might like to see me doing stuff like that too. Um, but yeah, I've just been having a lot of fun there. It gets easier with time. The more you're posting, the quicker it all comes.
You're always bad at first, right? Like, when you're writing, like
Yes,
your first book always seems to take forever, but the second and third books like continue to go faster. So
exactly.
you said you talked about TikTok was taking 5 hours, and like how do you deal with that? Like what's what's kind of like your daily habits as far as writing? Like do you try to get a workout in? Do you just set a time aside that's my writing time? Like what do you do?
I think, and I probably honestly could work a little more on my structure. But what I'm starting to find works really well for me is I like to read a chapter or two in my genre, and I encourage people to read in their genres specifically. If you're doing that for the sake of, like researching what's working well in your genre. Um, and I have a funny little story about that I can touch on later. But I'll read for maybe a chapter or two or an hour's worth of reading. Then I will go for a walk. And I should add right now that I am currently actually laid off from my day job, so I have a lot more time than I used to. But what I'll do is I'll go
Sorry to
for
hear
a
that.
walk in. No, no, it's fine. But I would not have been able to write my next two books if it wasn't for this. So I've got a park that's right nearby my house. I'll walk and I'll just let my mind kind of roam and I'll start thinking about, hey, here's what I want to happen in a chapter. I mentioned earlier that I've got my 5 key milestones. So anytime I'm between milestone 1 and 2, I'm thinking about, hey, I know this has to happen so I can write a chapter where this series of events takes place and all of my check boxes are ticked off. Coffee shop. I like being kind of surrounded by energy and little hubbub and surrounding background noise. Or else I'll just do it in the silence of my house. But I try to get probably between 2 to 3,000 words of writing in. Then I can really only write for like an hour or two though before my brain just stops working. And then I start working on my social media. So I think I walked through the significant aspects of my day. I will say right now, for example, I'm editing my 2 manuscripts of my prequel novella. In, I probably should still be writing book 3, but what I'm doing right now is just trying to get through 6,000 words a day of self edits, going through and just making sure, like, hey, I write little notes to myself in the middle of writing, like, oh crap, I need this to happen in an earlier scene so that it makes sense when I have a character do something in chapter 11 self edits. I take a look, I say, okay, I remember there are things that happen later on and I have to set them up properly. So that's kind of my self edit phase is cleaning up words, uh, using some better descriptions than she was grumpy and she turned away really mad. I can get into the more fun, creative side of the writing because my first draft, I just try to plow through and get all the events just written down.
Well, that's good. You can't edit a manuscript if you don't have a manuscript. So
Exactly.
getting it out on the paper is key.
Hmm.
No, that's awesome.
I think,
Go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just going to say that, and I've heard this a lot from other authors too, and uh, it's just completely true. In my earlier versions, I mentioned that this is like my third version of the manuscript for my first book. Um, every other version I ever had, I never finished. And it was because I would write chapter one and then I'd write chapter two and be like, ooh, that's really cool. I should now go back into chapter one and add those setups, the things that I was just talking about, I'm doing in my self edits. But I would do that on a chapter by chapter basis. And then I would never get past like chapter 10 because you keep on going back. Whereas if you just go through, you don't stop until you hit the end. You can take time after you've written that final scene to add all those setups in for that great climactic payoff.
That's great advice. Get through your book and then you can go back and edit. Um,
Hmm.
Sometimes, people like to do that. They like to read a chapter and then move on. Sometimes they edit, sometimes they don't. But I think if you're continually on the editing phase and writing phase at the same time, that's where that's where I get stuck a lot. It's like, oh, that's a stupid sentence. So like I try to fix it, and then I'm like, oh, that's a stupid sentence too. So and that's just like discouraging and disheartening. Whereas like one of my habits that I'm trying to distill is just get it out on page and get it done, and then I can go back and fix.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you mentioned Andy Peliquin earlier. I think he posted something recently and he talks about how there are two different sides of your brain working in there's the creative portion when you're actually writing, but then there's I guess, whatever the opposite of creative portion is. Can you tell I was an
Analytical.
English major? Yeah, analytical, exactly. Um, so that analytical side, you're working two completely different muscles of the brain. So it's okay to, just accept that whatever you're doing is your creative side, just getting something down on the paper and you can analyze it later.
So, you could have been, you chose the indie path versus the traditionally published. What were some of the thought processes in going to that? Why did you choose to become an indie author?
I honestly did not have any real thought process behind it. Um, I've done a lot of short story writing. Like I've probably written 8 years worth of short stories, and some of these are little fairy tales or sci-fi. They're not. None of them are even epic fantasy. Like they're Aesop's fable type things, or little coming of age stories and animal companion stories. Um, and I've always had an idea that, hey, one day I'll publish these, but I'll just self-publish them because that would be easier. So I think I was kind of like pre um, configured. I don't know the word I'm looking for, but my mind was kind of set on this path of like I'll just do self-publishing one day because I want to be able to do it on my own terms and I don't want to have to deal with a bunch of hassle. Back then it was like, do I really want to deal with hassle just to get a short story out into the world? No. When I started writing a novel, I guess I never really stopped to think, do I want to deal but honestly, I still think if I had thought deeper on it, I still wouldn't have done it. I like having kind of my hand in all the different pots. It's exciting to me. It's fun.
Well, you say you like the data, and that you don't get to see that if you're traditionally published. Like they'll send you a report later on, but like you get real time data as you're doing the indie publishing route.
Yeah, definitely. So having that control over all the different information coming in is I'm not a control freak. Just don't ask anybody I know, but trust me, I'm not a control freak.
Not at all. So you mentioned 20 books earlier. That's where we met. What were some of the things that you took away from that? What were some of the things that you enjoyed about that? And well, I guess I should ask first. Was that your first time, or have you been before?
It was my first time. I honestly feel like such a newbie to the indie world or even just publishing world in general. I think the most like inspiring thing for me from that came out of 20 books was just how down to earth everybody was. And how well I was having conversations with people at the like opening kind of mixer meet and greet on Monday night. And people are just saying, like, oh, yeah, asking me, little newbie me, who at that point had a book out for like a week and a half or so. Um, and they're like, oh, yeah, what's your creative process? and then later I find out that they're on a panel of seven-figure authors. I'm just like, how the heck this person was so personable and just like totally engaged and chatting with me and giving me tips. And to see that people from all different levels and stages of their career um, are just happy to share what they know and to meet others, that was by far the most incredible experience, really. And it was really exciting too, because I mentioned, I'm laid off right now, and I'm thinking like, wow, I could actually do this and try going full time. So we'll see how that pans out. But I at least know that it can happen. Might be a little while before I get there, but it's
I,
super inspiring to see.
no, I find that that's very encouraging for me too. Is like, yeah, there are people on this route writing in whatever genre they want. It doesn't have to be epic fantasy, but like there are people, many, many people out there that are writing in whatever they want and finding a way to make a living at it. And so that's
Yes,
encouraging. In fact, when
absolutely.
I interviewed Dan Wells, I don't know if you know who he is, but he's one of Brandon Sanderson's good friends, and they took the
Mm.
class that Brandon is teaching now at BYU together. It was taught by Dave Wolverton, also known as Dave Farland. And Dan said the very first thing that Dave put on the board, he wrote, "You can make a living as a writer." And he said that they both, Brandon and him just looked at each other and was like, okay, like there's some encouragement. And so to have many, I don't know how many people are there, that couple thousand, 5,000, I don't know how many people,
Yeah,
but like there were, I don't know, so many people who are making a full-time wage writing as a living. And so that's encouraging to, and like you said, there are people who were seven-figure authors who were just like, yeah, let's go have let's go have dinner or have lunch or whatever. And you're like, oh, okay.
yes, I agree with you 100% right there.
So you talk about, you're part of an indie author group. How important is networking been for you?
I think that it has been like insanely important. I went into this, I'm like, okay, I didn't even realize that there's a thing called Amazon ads that I might have to look at, or BookBub, or all these different things, and how to market the book. And but there are people who have been there already, who know how to deal with different administrative tasks in Amazon and KDP, and how to plan your promo days and promo stacking and all these different things. I'm like, oh my gosh, I would have never thought if I had known some of those things, maybe I would have gone the traditional publishing route after all. Um, but yeah, to just be able to have people who can give you advice on what to do next and where you should be focusing. Uh, one of the greatest things, and I think I mentioned this, the idea to write your full novel and do not go final chapter. Like it sounds really simple, but if nobody had told me that, I never would have started doing it. And I guarantee you I would not have this book ready right now. And I can say that for sure because it took me 10 years to get to the point where I had the book finished. So I clearly wasn't doing things the right way before. So yeah, having that support has been monumental.
You're working on the book, you're working on social media, you're doing all this stuff. What do you do to take your mind? What do you do to relax, to kind of rejuvenate yourself?
I like playing video games, and uh, you know, and I think that even might come through in some of my writing. I always loved the Morrowind and Elder Scroll games, Elden Ring when that came out, Zelda, Breath of the Wild. I always love that character building, creative worlds that you can discover. So I think that might come through in my writing. I have found that I just have. I think as I've been writing more, I'm more excited even to write, and I've been playing less video games. But I, I enjoy watching The Office and Parks and Rec reruns. Um, and truly like the long walks where I'm just thinking about the next chapter in my book, I've come to really love those. I live in San Francisco, so the weather's always pretty much the same, and walking is always a doable thing.
That's
It's never
good.
so cold that you can't go out. I hate the cold. Um, but yeah, I feel like that's probably the bulk of how I spend my free time. That and board games. I love board games.
Awesome. So, who are some of the indie authors that you've maybe met, or you wouldn't even have to meet him, that you've kind of looked up to kind of pattern your, if I can pattern my career like this, who would it be?
Yeah, so I think, and I haven't met him, but Will White, when I first started reading his Cradle series, I was like, what? You can do this in a story happening right in the from in every single chapter. I think having grown up again with these long, sprawling epic fantasies, it's always like, oh no, you've got to slowly build up and get into the world. But no, I think well, anyway, going back to your question, so Will White, I really like his writing. Michael Webb, Andy Pelequin, there is Ryan Cahill, ML Spencer. I'm just blown away by how they're able to take classic tropes, spin them into a news story, and keep putting out more content. It's like, how are you writing this much? And again, it's encouraging for me to see that. You know, I would think in traditional publishing, I feel like, and maybe I'm mistaken in this, but it like any of the big books, those big door stopper books, which are the ones I gravitate towards, seem to come like a year apart. But with indie publishing, you can make your own schedule. So if you're going full time and you can put three, four, five of those out in a year, like nothing's stopping you. It was kind of eye-opening to see that there's this whole other side of the publishing industry and the stories. You know, you're just getting into these great character-driven fantasies, and that's what I love.
No, and that's exciting about publishing as an indie publisher too, is that you're not constrained by what the traditional publishers want. Like you can, if
Hmm.
you have a story that you want to put out in the world, you can do it, and you can do it as fast as you want.
Exactly, exactly. And I think somebody was even saying it's like you essentially set your publishing schedule. You know, so if you're putting one book out a year, you're building up your newsletter, you're building up your fan base. They come to expect that, and that's perfectly fine. You're putting out three books a year, great. Your fan base is expecting that, and you kind of get there's. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but somebody phrased in my writing group, they phrased it this way, saying, you know, you've got your readers who are reading one to two books a year. They're the ones going to Barnes and Noble and they're just looking for the latest New York Best Time or New York
Bestseller.
Times bestseller. Tongue twister there. Um, and then you have people who are reading ebooks and they're devouring one to two books a week. And it's like a completely different market, you know. And I think that a lot of maybe the traditional publishing is geared towards the one to two book a year type people, whereas indie can reach so many more people.
I know quite a few traditionally published authors that I've interviewed, and some of them were at 20 books, and they have their own podcast, and um, they had a live episode where they were talking to a publisher, but he was kind of like an indie publisher type guy, and watching the two traditionally published authors interview this guy and saying this guy saying how popular and how much money is being made on Kindle Unlimited and Kindle Books. Like these guys, their face was just in shock because it's a field and a um, new media that they really haven't gotten into because of their traditional published out. Where like indie authors, they already know this because it's part like, how are we going to sell this? How are we going to make money? And if you go on any, find a Facebook group that's with indie authors or like self-published authors, they can tell you like things and tips and tricks and different things. And one of those things is, all right, yeah, well, there's always the debate, go wider or, be focused
Hmm.
on, and they'll tell you like the advantages and disadvantages of both and what, limited can do and what going wide can do. So being part, like we talked about networking earlier, being part of a network and finding those people who can help you, I think is really key.
Yeah, and I think what's the tagline of 20 books, that a rising tide lifts all boats?
Yep.
And it's just so true to see how indie authors support each other. And you know that there are readers who like reading epic fantasy, paranormal romance, urban apocalyptic, this, that, the other, right? When you find somebody who writes in the same genre as you, and they're willing to kind of connect with you and promote each other on each other's newsletters, not only are you helping yourself find new fans, and helping your other author companion find new fans as well. So you're expanding reach that way, but you're helping the readers discover more things that they like. Again, these are people who are reading one to three books a week. It takes a while to write an epic fantasy. I can't be putting a new book out every single week. Can show them new authors is just really cool. And again, from that like research side of on my end, and kind of and honing my own author craft, I get to read what all these other authors are putting out there and seeing how they are um uh, putting a spin on tropes, and how they've added their unique flair to these classic story elements. I get to wear my reader pants at that stage, although I do try to still do it with a little bit of an analytical mind and say, that's how that story worked out so well.
Right. And that's part of the fun of being an indie author too, is meeting other people and sharing their books and discovering books. Because like you mentioned,
Hmm.
ML Spencer and Andy Peliquin and Michael Webb and all these people, like they write fantastic books. And like because they are not traditionally published, like people aren't going to see their books in Barnes and Noble. People, so like being able to introduce these people to your audience, I think is really special and something that I have this special thing that I can share with you that is amazing, and and I know you like it too because you like my stuff too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely agree 100%.
So Rocco, before we get off, is there any other tips or tricks that you'd like to share before we leave?
Gosh, I think the only other thing I would add would be just keep sticking to it. I know, especially, again, from my perspective of having one single book out there in the universe, um, I did the thing. I wrote it all the way to the end, to that final climax, and I woke up one night, specifically the night after I wrote the climax. I woke up at 2 a.m., could not go to sleep because I hated the climax. I was like, why did I write that? It's terrible. You know what, though? You can always rewrite it. The key is to just get it out there. And I write epic fantasy, so the book was 180,000 words. It's like, okay, what is 2,500 words in the grand scheme of things? Like, just figure out what wasn't working in that scene and rewrite it. And then I did go the developmental editor route. I know that not it's an added cost. For me, it was definitely worth it, because somebody was able to just take a look and say, "Hey, love this part. However, this part's jarring," and then it let me focus on, okay, that's where my weakness is. After you're reading this 180,000 word book four different times, like your brain, your your eyes just glaze over. You need a set of fresh eyes to really point out the things that are missing in your story, the areas that have plot holes because you just know from a previous revision that you addressed it and you forgot that you actually cut that scene out.
Right. No, that's great advice. Rocco, go ahead and tell everybody how they can get a hold of you and how they can get your book.
Yeah, my book is available on Amazon and it's also on Kindle Unlimited. And you can find it's The Seam of Eternity. Here it is again. I'm on social media as Rocco Levitas author on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. I think yeah, that should all be the same handle there. Yeah,
Perfect. So get on his website, find him on social media, follow him. Let's help his social media presence grow, and let's get his book out there and sell millions of
yay.
copies.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carson.
Thank you for listening to the Troy Podcast. Please subscribe, like, and share with your friends.